Hello everyone, I'm Jean Anderson, the Secretary of SNP CND. It's my great pleasure today to introduce Isobel Lindsay to talk about the early days of the campaign for nuclear disarmament and how the activists connected with the idea of Scottish independence. Isobel's been active in the CND from her youth and is Scottish CND's Vice Chair. She's a former sociology lecturer and well known as a worker for peace and as a supporter of Scottish independence. Isobel was one of the original signatories of the Committee of 100 anti-war group in 1960, and she was a member of their anti-nuclear civil disobedience campaign in 1961. She was also part of the growth of the Scottish National Party in the 1960s and 1970s. She was an SNP councillor for Glasgow City. She was a member of the party's national executive, becoming vice chair in 1972. And Isobel was the final convener of the campaign for Scottish Assembly, which paved the way for Scottish devolution. Although not a member of SNP CND, Isobel continues to help us with her extensive knowledge and her understanding of both campaigns. Today we will hear her describe their development. Isobel, can you start by telling us why you became an activist?
Well, I was always aware from childhood of what nuclear weapons were and how horrific they were, because my father had been with the British forces which went into Hiroshima after the bomb had been dropped, sometime after the bomb had been dropped. And so he had first-hand knowledge and images of it. We had a melted beer bottle at home that he'd picked up on the edge of the city. We had some postcards of what had been done to the city. I think they must have been produced by the British forces. He'd got them while he was there. And he was stationed with a Japanese family. So I had some knowledge from a very early age, and I was interested in politics generally when I was pretty young. So I was always anxious to do things, to be active. And I think the very first thing I did take part in, it must have been before the formation of CND, but it was the Reverend James Curry. I would only have been 14, 15, I'm not sure. It was the Reverend James Curry, who was a well-known figure, and I can't remember if he was Iona Community, or certainly he was closely associated with. And in his parish in Pollock, he had an anti-bomb demonstration. And I lived in Hamilton, but I went into that. When I was 1960, when I was 16, I joined the Labour Party Young Socialists. And of course, this was an issue of considerable debate and interest that I engaged in at that time. Now, CND had been formed UK-wide in 1958. There had been activities during the 50s, the mid-50s, particularly focused against nuclear testing. And I know the Iona Community had a small campaign group going at that period. There was a group in Edinburgh, very much focusing on both the general anti-nuclear case, but particularly on nuclear testing, because the UK had tested its first weapons at early 60s, I think it was at early 50s, I think it was 53 or so. I would say that the activity in England was probably higher at that point, 58, 59, 60, than it was in Scotland, because we had the Aldermaston marches had started, and there was, I think, more heightened activity there. The big change took place in late 1960 with the announcement of the Holy Loch base. Now, looking back, I think that whole campaign against that Holy Loch base had an important link to the development in the late 60s of the SNP. At the beginning of the 60s, SNP was absolutely fringe. And, but of course, by the end of the 60s, that was a very different matter. And although we weren't really conscious, I think, of that at the time, it is, in retrospect, I think one can see that as a very significant strand. Now, what of course happened was that incidentally, that there had been the formation of a Lanarkshire CND, and I joined that and I became secretary. Now, at the late November in 1960, Macmillan announced that there was going to be a major nuclear base in Scotland at the Holy Loch by the beginning of March. You know, in other words, 3 months, you're going to have a major nuclear base in Scotland. Had we known some of the background to this, we would have been even angrier than we were, because the information that has emerged, which was secret government information at that time, it was really so outrageous, much of it, because what had happened was that the UK had not been successful in being able to produce an effective delivery system for its nuclear weapons. We'd had the big failure of Blue Streak and 1 or 2 other projects. So they went to the States really to plead for the Polaris system to be given to the UK, so that they could develop this as an independent, in inverted commas, of course, an independent UK system. Now, what the Americans asked for in return, they were reluctant, of course, to do this, but in return, they wanted a European base for their Polaris system. And so the quid pro quo for giving Britain access to Polaris was that Britain would give them a base for their Polaris fleet. Now, in the negotiations that took place, the Americans were quite clear they wanted the Holy Loch, because it was convenient in all kinds of geographical ways, but also it was close to a city with all the amenities for the staff. And it was, of course, also comparatively close to Prestwick Airport. Now, Macmillan, as he expresses in correspondence at the time, the Prime Minister Macmillan, he was very unhappy about this. He was unhappy about this, to be fair to him, because he thought it wasn't appropriate to site it so close to the major population centres in Scotland, but also because he was very, very worried about the Glaswegians and about the political response there would be in Scotland if this was done. And he did try backwards and forwards to offer other sites. Particularly, he pushed Loch Linnhe, and on the basis that, you know, this would really just be some compliant Highlanders and not many in number who would complain, rather than the unpredictable Glaswegians. So all that was going on in the background, but then suddenly, we didn't know about this, but suddenly we're told we're going to have this major base. So that prompted the very fairly low-key anti-nuclear movement in Scotland sparked it into life. So there was an eruption of activity, and it was pretty broad-based because we had a lot of trade union support, although not all of it, because similarly we had a lot of Labour Party support, although not all of it, because it was divided. We had support from other left groupings in Scotland. We had significant church support, although again that was divided. So very, very quickly, just after that November announcement, we had major demonstration in Glasgow, and then right onwards up till March, we had a number of demonstrations, both in Glasgow and at the Holy Loch. And it was a big eruption of activity. Now, some interesting things did take place there that were, shall we say, very distinctively Scottish. And I think there was a lot of Scottish emphasis in the campaign, because there was the feeling that, citing a base so close to the major population centre, it wouldn't have been allowed in the US. People were very doubtful would it have been allowed 30 miles from London. And so there was the feeling that Scotland had never been consulted, was being treated as dispensable. So there was that strand, but we also had a range of people coming forward very creatively in the campaigning that was going on. And one of those strands was the folk song one. There was a lively folk scene in Scotland, particularly the west of Scotland at that time. And some of it was just left-wing politics in terms of its background, but there was also a nationalist strand there too. And a group of the folk singers and composers got together and worked on the folk songs for the campaign. And that became very much characteristics of that Scottish anti-Polaris movement in many ways. And I remember they were very, they thought it very important that we move away from the rather hymn-like campaigning that was prevalent in the English campaigns. And instead that this should be a defiant and very Scottish approach. So we had the, you can't spend a dollar when you're dead. We had the Glasgow Eskimos. I'll say a little bit more about the background to that. We had a whole stream of songs which they were literally, writing one day, and we were singing them by the weekend. One of the key people there who was a nationalist of long standing was Maurice Blythman, whose daughter incidentally is Joanna, the well-known food writer. But there were a whole range of others, including the singer Josh McCrae, Jackie O'Connor, people like that, whose background was broadly Glasgow left. Now, one of the things that also happened over this period that drew me into this civil disobedience side was that after the announcement of at the base, the Direct Action Committee, which was a small direct action organisation that had been set up in the mid-50s, I think, early or mid-50s, had decided to have a London to Holy Loch march, ending with a sit-down at the Holy Loch. They had had small sit-downs in bases in England, but we were talking about a dozen or so here and there. So they got in touch with me as Secretary of Lanarkshire CND because they were coming through Lanarkshire, and they wanted arrangements made for hospitality for the marchers. So those of us in Lanarkshire CND took that task on. I can remember going to see Mick McGahey, the Scottish NUM leader, because of course there was still mining at that time, very active still, and of course they had miners' welfares. So he immediately said, "Fine, great, our miners' welfares, we'll put them up, and we'll provide any hospitality that you want." So we had that assistance, and there were a range of people who put people up in their own homes as well. And the churches, it wasn't so easy in those days, because the church was not, the Church of Scotland and the Roman Catholic Church were not officially anti-nuclear at that point in time. Big battles had to take place before that change happened. So some individual ministers might be sympathetic, but they had to get their church's agreement. So that wasn't always so easy to get. So I can remember, my family home, my parents having, I think, 2 or 3 of the marchers sleeping on the floor at home. So because of that, I got to know some of the Direct Action Committee people. And by that time, we had had the launch of the Committee of 100, who had had their first big demonstration in London in February '61, and they had, I think, a couple of thousand people sitting down, may have been more than that, but sitting down in central London. It was, it was Bertrand Russell who was the figurehead for the Committee of 100, but many other artists and others who supported it. And the approach was a little naive in terms of what ultimately happened. The approach was, if there are 100 names saying we are the organisers, you can't just pick off 1 or 2. And if we have several thousand people sitting down, you have to arrest all of us. So the Direct Action Committee had merged. By the time they got over the border into Scotland, they had already merged into the Committee of 100. And when I joined them just in the last 2 or 3 days of their march to the Holy Loch. And there was a supporting march in Dunoon, but they had a fair number of people. The reason why I don't have the exact number is that the police decided, although we blocked the pier at Arnadam, but the police decided tactically not to arrest anyone, just to let us sit for the 24 hours that we said we would sit for. Now, I would say there were perhaps 80, 90 of us probably. Most of them had come up from England, because apart from the marchers, there were also 1 or 2 buses had come up. But there were a fair sprinkling of Scots, but the whole civil disobedience idea, direct action idea, wasn't particularly within, shall we say, the culture of protest in Scotland at that stage. So after that, I was asked if I would become a Committee of 100, one of the signatories there. And interestingly enough, it wasn't something that I noticed at the time. It's only looking back at the list, I realised that there were only 4 Scots in that list of 100. So apart from me at that stage, it was Roland Muirhead, he'd be about 92 at that time, one of the outstanding independence leaders, Home Rule leaders, going back to the late 19th century in his activism. There was Oliver Brown, another key independence campaigners for years, and there was Hugh McDermott again. So it was just interesting that those were people who had volunteered and shown an interest in trying to promote the more militant civil disobedience approach to in the anti-nuclear movement. Now, it was decided, the Committee of 100 decided that we would have another try for a much bigger sit-down blocking of the base. It was comparatively easy because it wasn't a standard base. You know, it was because it was a submarine base. And the reason why they could set it up so quickly, you know, that 3 months warning, was that you only had to have initially the big supply ship, which could provide accommodation, and it could provide all kinds of assistance and support to the submarines coming in. So it was a small pier, Ardnadam Pier, that they operated from, and it was therefore comparatively easy to block. We had blocked it at Whitsun 61 when the Direct Action Committee march finished there. We did block it for the 24 hours, and there were a few sailors were due to be on and off the supply ship, and they had to clamber over us. Actually, I had a sailor climbing over me at the time. So we thought, if we can get, perhaps 800 or so blocking the base in September, then we can put on a really effective civil disobedience show. So I agreed. I was due to start university in October. So I agreed. I'm very happy to work all during the summer on this demonstration. And there was a member of the Committee of 100 staff from London who was based in Glasgow. The offices we were based in were the ILP offices, the Independent Labour Party office. I know sometimes when I mention that, people say, was there still an ILP? Actually, I hadn't known there was still an ILP at that time, but they still had an office in Glasgow, and they gave us a room there to work from. Now, there were a whole range of things that were, of course, happening in that 61 period, 60-61 period, that were quite important to know in terms of background. The Labour Party had, of course, now it would have been 1960, they had passed a resolution very much against the wishes of the leadership. a lot of it because of the support of some of the big unions, like the Transport and General Workers Union, to support unilateral nuclear disarmament as Labour Party policy. And of course, the leader of the Labour Party at that time, Hugh Gaitskell, made his famous, "I will fight, fight and fight again to reverse this policy." And of course, he did successfully reverse that policy the following year. So this was a very bitter battle going on politically in the Labour Party. And that was reflected in Scotland too. I would say that there was much stronger rank and file support probably in Scotland, and some strong union support, particularly from the STUC, but by no means all. It was still a bitter battle there. But we set up the Anti-Polaris Coordinating Committee early on over that period from the beginning of 1961. And we had the various organisations who were supportive, and the SNP was represented. Now, I was never very sure, I can't honestly remember, the person I do remember coming along regularly, but I'm not sure whether Oliver Brown, who had been a bit of a rebel in the context of the SNP, he had certainly been one of the breakaway at a certain point, but Oliver was a regular attender at the Anti-Polaris Coordinating Committee. And the SNP was represented. But of course we had various anti-nuclear groups and some church groups, and trades councils were a really lively and active force at that time in Scotland, which of course they ceased to be. Not that they ceased to exist, but they diminished greatly, as much of the trade union movement did later. So we did coordinate from an early time, and I think one of the interesting things about that, it was an opportunity for people to get to know others whom they perhaps had not worked with before. And certainly I found myself getting to know people, and I think it was you know, a good experience in Scottish politics. So the situation, I had stayed in the Labour Party for a couple of years, was it perhaps 3 years? The point at which I decided to leave, it wasn't at the time that Gaitskell had reversed the policy, because, okay, it had been done according to the rules. There had been some degree of democracy, you could say, involved. But it was when George Brown, who was the Shadow Foreign Secretary at that time, came back from the United States. The United States had resumed atmospheric testing. Now, the atmospheric testing had been overwhelmingly opposed by the Labour Party in terms of its annual conference. So there was no question about it being Labour Party policy by a 2/3 majority. George Brown came back from the United States. I remember watching this and said, well, it's very unfortunate and all that, but in the circumstances, it's understandable, and I think we have to give them our backing. That was the point at which I said, forget it, in terms of Labour Party membership. It's one thing fighting something out democratically, even with all the manoeuvring of leaderships, but it's another thing when you fight out and you win overwhelmingly, and they still ignore it. You know, what's the point? And I think there were a fair number who left at that point. Probably not so many, but there was certainly a fair number who left at a later stage, which I'll come on to. So what happened is that we worked very actively during that summer of 61. CND was pursuing, Scottish CND, all its activities as well. I was mainly focused on the Committee of 100 and the Iona Communities premises in Clyde Street in Glasgow. There was a tiny office there, and they gave it to us to work from. We worked organising the demonstration from the ILP office, but they gave us, for other purposes, they gave us the tiny office in Clyde Street. So we worked, we worked with a wide variety of people, going around to see people, getting all kinds of support, and we put a particular emphasis on it. We were terribly keen in Scotland that the demonstrations, particularly the civil disobedience demonstrations, should be representative of the ordinary Scottish public, rather than should be the focus of, shall we say, the literary minority, the political minorities, the religious minorities. We were very keen to get trade unionists in there. We were very keen to get what you could identify as very ordinary working class in there, and put quite a lot of emphasis in trying to do this. Sometimes I think perhaps I was a little underappreciative of some of the, shall we say, more creative activities that went on in retrospect, because of course we had the canoeists who, there were just a few of them, but they took their canoes out and actually managed to get on part of a submarine. That is, of course, where one of the best known of the Anti-Polaris songs, the Glasgow Eskimos, because the captain of the supply ship, Captain Lanning, called them a crowd of ex-Eskimos, you know, just dismissed them, a crowd of Eskimos. So, of course, the songwriters got very busy and said, you know, hello, hello, we are the Eskimos, and we'll gaff and yaff like Lanning and spear him where he blows. So, not very non-violent, but so that added a lot of colour. But I was always a little bit anxious. Maybe it makes us look too much, shall we say, part of a minority rather than mainstream. But of course, what one learns is that all of these different strands are so important.
We're going to take a short break now, and we'll come back to Isobel and find out what happens in Dunoon in the early 1970s in the next instalment.